Hello, everyone, and welcome to our anti-Asian violence panel discussion, Pandemic Panics, the Surging Violence Against Asian Americans. My name is Michael Singh, and I will be one of your hosts for today. I am a junior majoring in journalism and also the co-president of the Asian Americans Journalists Association USC chapter.
And I'm Eddie Sun, the other host, and I'm a sophomore journalism major and a co-chair of the Annenberg Cross-Cultural Student Association. Thank you so much to everyone for coming to our panelist discussion. Due to the recent tragedy in Atlanta, this conversation is more important than ever to have. Thus, we are extending the event time to 7:30. We hope you can stay for the entire event, but we understand that some of you may need to leave beforehand. Before we begin the discussion, we wanted to open up with a short introduction video.
This time, a man stabbed in the back in Lower Manhattan, and right now, he's fighting for his life.
Police charged a woman this week with a hate crime after cops say she spat on an Asian man and used an ethnic slur.
President Biden is demanding an end to the spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans.
There have been more than 2,500 incidents of anti-Asian hate crimes reported between March and September of last year.
The surge in hate crimes against Asian Americans only getting worse, and some of the accounts are extremely violent.
Vicious hate crimes against Asian Americans who've been attacked, harassed, blamed, and scapegoated. At this very moment.
We're going to start in Atlanta because there are fears this morning that a string of deadly shootings at massage parlors in the Atlanta area could be linked to a wave of attacks against Asian Americans. 8 people were killed in the city and at least 1 wounded in those attacks yesterday night, and at least half of the victims are believed to be Asian women. The suspect, arrested 150 miles away after a chase, is a white man. His name is Robert Aaron Long.
Leading us into the discussion, I would like to introduce all of you to our moderators for tonight, Connie Dang and Nathan Hyun.
Hi, everybody. My name's Connie. I'm a public relations major with a double minor in entertainment industry and management consulting.
And hello, my name is Nathan Hyun. I'm a junior majoring in journalism with minors in sports media and marketing, and I'm a part of the Asian American Journalists Association at USC.
And for our main event, we are extremely grateful to have 5 guests join us in leading today's discussion. Here is LA Times Metro reporter Anh Do.
Hi.
Journalism educator Jon Funabiki.
Hi.
Co-president of USC SCAPE Joyce Jang. Professor, licensed counseling psychologist, and anti-racist educator Dr. Sherry Wang.
Everyone.
And Christina Yang, General Counsel and Pro Bono Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, LA. In the interest of time, we will jump right into the discussion.
Thank you, Eddie. So to start off this panel, thank you everyone for being here tonight. I think we have a lot to talk about with the recent mass shooting and tragedy in Atlanta. Just first off, how are we processing these recent events? Let's start with Joyce.
I have been in a lot of conversations with my Asian peers, my mentees, my mentors. I think it's a frightening time to be Asian, and so it's a lot of mutual checking in on each other. The Student Coalition for Asian Pacific Empowerment, the club I'm co-president of, we're thinking about having a healing space on Monday so we can discuss it and process it as students.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Funabiki, what about you?
Well, first, thank you very much for doing this. I'm 2,500 miles away from Atlanta, and I don't know the victims of the mass shooting. And yet I actually feel like I'm grieving, and I'm worried. And I think that our country is in a real crisis. And I'm hoping that journalists will respond to this crisis and help us work through it.
Thank you. I'll go to Dr. Wang.
I think this is a really terrifying time for folks right now. There's a lot of anxiety. You know, I'm coming from a position and in the role of mental health, and I think most people will talk about diagnosable and diagnostic categories like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, acute stress, and I think that those certainly we're going to see some of it come up. But I actually think what we're also going to see is a lot of underreporting of that, which is pretty consistent with how it's been for Asian Americans. And not only about that, but I think we fail to think about what it means in terms of lack of quality of life. That even after social distancing is, you know, after that is no longer enforced, after we can go out and maybe, you know, partake in the activities that we used to, I think Asian Americans will still be scared to go out. And so even now, I think we are changing our behaviors and our lifestyles so that we don't get anxious, so that we, well, so let me rephrase. We don't get more anxious than we already are. And we don't get more depressed, not doing well with it, and is needing the support and the space to be able to do what we have together.
Thank you. So yeah, I can go to Christina now.
Sure, and thank you again to USC and all the organizers for inviting Advancing Justice LA to participate this evening. Certainly, I echo my fellow panelists. This is a very difficult time for the communities that we serve. And, you know, as a nonprofit civil rights organization, we were already working in this space very actively, helping folks who've survived similar hate incidents. And it has been really discouraging over the past many months to see this continued increase in hateful rhetoric and hateful acts, and now culminating in actual murders. And so I think I'm just hopeful that through continued dialogue and collaboration with other communities of color and folks who are underserved, that we can continue to move towards a more positive direction where you know, hopefully one day we won't have to see these things happen anymore.
Thank you. And for this question, I'll finish off with Anne.
Yes, thank you. Please let me thank first the organizers and also the audience for your valuable time tonight. When I think about what's happening around the nation, I think mostly of vigilance. A lot of the people that we talk to on the streets, on the phone, in private spaces and public arenas, they tell us that more than ever, they have to not only look over their shoulders, but to try to avoid being too Asian, quote unquote, and to go mainly where there are other Asians so that they're not standing targets. It's a time to cater to the moment, but also to rise to the moment.
And I think, Anne, I want to follow up on that question with, you know, there's been a lot of the hashtag Stop Asian Hate and that whole movement that's been going on with the last couple of days. How do you think the tragedy that happened in Atlanta will shape the movement as we go forward?
You know, we have an internal communications channel that we're discussing these same topics, and the hashtag, some people are concerned that Asians may be preempting the BLM movement. And so there seems to be a push toward other, you know, terms such as Stop AAPI Hate, or find ways to ask for reparations for Asians. We're looking into that to see if those will be future stories.
Thank you. I think Mr. Funabiki, I'll ask you that as well. You know, as a journalism educator and with so much experience behind this movement, what's your thoughts and opinions on this?
Well, I think we're seeing journalists respond as we would expect them. They're covering the Atlantic crisis and trying to uncover, you know, who are the victims, who's the suspect, what's behind the motivations, the police investigation, et cetera. And people like Anne are looking at the community and seeing how they're affected. These are all the kinds of stories we would expect, and we're getting actually pretty good coverage of these in this first few days. What I hope is that journalists will go much deeper and kind of touching on some of the subjects we've already hit on. You know, this is not just an Asian story. This is really a social justice racism story that affects all people of color, that we not separate Asians from other people of color who are also the victim of kind of racist attacks in systemic racism. We can't forget that. We can't forget that larger picture.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass it on to my other moderator, Connie, to carry on the conversation. But I also remind the audience to please ask your questions in the Q&A chat, and we'll get to those at the end of this discussion.
Yeah, thank you all so much for speaking on those points. Obviously, this tragedy has sparked a variety of emotions within our community, from anger to fear to frustration. And I think we've all been very deeply affected by everything that's going on. So this question is for Joyce and Dr. Wang. What can staff and administrators do to make sure Asian students and workers feel more safe and more comforted and empowered? Dr. Wang, if you can speak on it first.
Sure, I think we want to start with the fact that Asian Americans are not okay. I think recognizing that and then moving with that assumption is going to be best, as opposed to waiting to see, especially thinking about students. I think people are going to be focusing on, like, how are you doing in school? And if you're doing okay in school, then that means you're probably fine. And I think that is the wrong thing, and that actually probably that assumption for our communities in particular come from the model minority stereotype and the model minority myth that we are high achieving, that we're excelling, that it's about our cultural trait, and something that we're inherently born with, which all of which are false. It's a very colorblind narrative. And so I think it actually is really incumbent for everybody to recognize that about us, to recognize that we are people of color as well. And it's really, really heartbreaking that I have to often say that, because I think the plight of Asian Americans, I would describe it with two key words, which is invisibility, right? Invisibility in the media, invisibility in our understanding of race, which has been really on a black-white dialectic. And so where do we fit? We don't fit anywhere. We're neither here or there, which also means that when we experience racism, we don't get the same kind of empathy, or even the same kind of listening space that the research that I'm doing on Asian American experiences of anti-Asian racism has been that when we do speak up about it, we experience gaslighting, where people are like, "Nuh-uh, what do you know about racism?" Or mocking it, like, "Okay, yeah, sure, like that really happened to you," or even things like, "Well, welcome to the club. Now you really know what it's like to be a person of color." And so the casualness and the acceptability of our experiences of racism renders us so invisible and makes us so isolated. And I would emphasize that we are isolated from our BIPOC communities, who generally those are the folks that we would go to say, we need solidarity, we need support. And yet we are being told that our experiences are not at the same level. So thinking about invisibility and isolation, we need lots of support. We need folks to check in on us. We need folks to intervene in terms of bystander interventions, and to really recognize that our racial trauma is not only just what happened in the moment, but also what happens afterwards in terms of everybody else's silence. When people don't check in on us, when people don't ask about us, when people don't intervene. And then when people keep insisting on, you need to report, as though reporting is the reason that it happened, or that if we reported, then there would no longer be racism, all of which is untrue. So I think it really is attending to us and seeing, humanizing us, because historically Asian Americans, this is very American actually, to treat Asian Americans the way that we have been, which is to not see us, or to only see us for the parts people want to see, which is the model minority stereotype.
Yeah, I think like Dr. Wang said, Asian American students are really hurting from the model minority stereotype. And I think, speaking as a student, I would love to see the university examine its own biases and its own systems of oppression. All universities started as white institutions. We still continue to be historically predominantly white institutions. There are still systems of injustice that result in the interpersonal violence that we're seeing, the everyday microaggressions that we experience. And so I really think that the university or schools and workplaces, but I'm speaking about the university because I'm a student, has to really challenge itself and ask, is our curriculum exotifying or othering the East and Asia? Are our professors using language that is truly inclusive? And then we need to really examine all aspects of the systemic oppression that can happen in order to kind of make students feel safe, make sure that like if these acts of violence happen, they have an outlet to go to. And also speaking on that, I really think that the university needs to honestly just give money to the cultural centers. They support us so much. Same for counseling and mental health services. I know USC does have drop-in sessions for Aapi folks specifically, and those spaces are incredibly valuable. And to be quite frank, we don't have enough of them. We have maybe like one person who's in charge of understanding the mental health of all of the Asian Americans during like one small Let's Talk session, and it's not enough. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that perspective. And Joyce, just to follow up on that, I know you touched on it a little bit, but what resources are available for USC and our outside Asian community just in the spaces that you found here?
Yeah, so speaking as a student, one of the first places that I found support and community was the Asian Pacific American Student Services. They're in the Student Union building with the other cultural service centers. Working closely with them is the Asian Pacific American Student Assembly, which is a student-run assembly for Aapi folks. It also is the umbrella organization for all the Asian organizations, which can also be a great resource. Personally, for me, SCAPE, the Student Coalition for Asian Pacific Empowerment, has been great because we form spaces for us to take up space. Like Dr. Wang said, there is a really big issue of invisibility. And so we need to be the ones to like proactively create these spaces for us to discuss, for us to be heard. And so that is what a lot of student orgs do. That's what SCAPE does. There's Let's Talk, which is a counseling and mental health drop-in with Engaman therapist. It's generally like 15-30 minutes. It's a really quick session, but those are open and you can just drop in. And then there's also the Engaman Student Counseling Center for more, like, rather than just a simple drop-in, more long-term solutions.
Yeah, thank you so much for all those resources that you listed. I think that our audience members will find them incredibly helpful. Thank you to both of you for answering that question. I'll pass it on to Nathan again for the next.
Thanks, Connie. So, I wanted to ask, at times we have seen the struggles between Asian and the Black communities. What comparisons can be made between the attacks against Asian Americans and the systematic mistreatment of African Americans as well? So what is the danger in comparing the Stop AAPI hate movement to the Black Lives Matter movement? Ms. Yang, if we could start with you.
Sure, thanks, Nathan. I think in grappling with the appropriate response organizationally to the increase in anti-API hate that we've all seen over the past year or so, something that's really important to Advancing Justice LA is really being mindful of what it means to call for increased law enforcement prosecution of these particular hate incidents against API individuals. We are certainly very cognizant of the impact of calling for such heightened prosecution on Black and Brown communities that we work alongside for racial justice more broadly. And so I think that's something, I think it's a sort of a needle that we need to thread carefully because of course, if someone is the victim of an attack, we certainly want to support that person in seeking help. And, if they want to work with law enforcement, that's certainly their prerogative. And that's something that we're focused on providing folks resources to do. At the same time, the truth is that from what we have seen and from what we have heard in our various conversations with LAPD, for example, only a small fraction of the hateful incidents that we all hear about on social media, or perhaps even from friends, families, neighbors, they just don't rise to the level of actual hate crimes that the police are going to pursue. And so knowing that that's the practicality that we're facing here, then, what are some other ways that we can focus on community-based interventions that are going to really be, caring for the community as a whole, for communities of color as a whole, as opposed to just focusing on, seeking out the perpetrator and trying to punish them for whatever they may or may not have done. And so what we're really focused on at the organization right now is trying to educate police and local law enforcement on, how to be more culturally sensitive and culturally competent when they are helping victims of these incidents. We're talking about things as basic as, providing LAPD with, small cards that they can keep with them to hand out to victims who might want to, might come to the police for help, and, give them some, phone numbers to organizations like ours where they can call a hotline and speak to someone in their native language and just, get comfort and possibly get connected to further social services or other resources that can help them deal with what they've gone through. And I think we're also focusing on bystander intervention as a tool, really getting folks in the general public comfortable with, helping someone if you see something happening, and of course intervening in a safe way, and just applying some really basic techniques to help de-escalate conflict in a way that maybe draws attention away from the person who is being targeted, in a way that hopefully resolves the situation in something and doesn't create something even worse for all involved.
Thank you. Yeah, I think like how you touched on, that whole community and bringing people involved. As I want to ask Mr. Funabiki the same question, and as a journalism educator with students like my age, like what do you tell us when comparing these different hate crimes that are across the country? With Asians and the Black Lives Matter movement, how do you see that all come together?
Thank you, Nathan. So I share a lot of the concerns that Christina has just mentioned. One of the worries I have is that the focus on the attacks, on the attacks, the incidents, could generate a kind of a knee-jerk law and order kind of reaction from the police and from people in the community and political forces, thinking that's the way to solve this problem. And certainly we have to cover these stories as journalists. But again, as my hope would be that the journalists would broaden the context of their coverage. Think of an attack, a mass shooting, as just the tip of the iceberg, and that they've got to go look deeper into the community, deeper into the structural issues that cause the inequalities in our society, inequalities in the schools, for example, affect Black students, Asian students, brown students. And these are problems that we have not resolved. And I think that journalists also have to find ways to help, in this case, Asian American communities understand that their lives are connected to Black communities and to brown communities, that we're not separate, that we don't live in silos. Well, we may live in silos, but we shouldn't be living in silos. But we are bound together by these social injustices. And journalists need to accept that responsibility and need to do the kind of coverage that can kind of promote progress.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it to Connie, where she's going to ask a question more about media coverage with the Asian community.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. And thank you, Mr. Funabiki, because that just segued perfectly into our next question. So let's shift a little to the media coverage of the Asian community, which has been an especially pertinent issue in the past few days. There have been many concerns that white perpetrators are being portrayed more amicably compared to other people of color who commit similar crimes. And this question is for Anne. What has your experience been as a journalist covering these hate crimes and your perceptions of the coverage on these topics?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Connie. One of the things that I'm often greeted with is people saying, when big things happen, journalists fly into town and they call it parachuting in, and you're just looking for the great sound bites and then you leave us. You don't really care about what happens over the long term. And it really takes a lot of time to peel back the layers and talk to ordinary citizens, to legislators, to activists, to explain to them some of our coverage goals. And recently I went to Oakland for 3 days just to dig into the anti-racism going on around Chinatown. And you get a lot of pushback. So I did something different. I did not rent a car, and I spent parts of the 3-day walking around town just to be able to interact with people on a more personal level and meet them where they are. And that gave me a better understanding of the lay of the land. And I was able to meet just people in the nooks and crannies of what I'm calling a little village within a city. And by village, it's not any kind of demeaning thing. I thought that it was more close-knit than in an urban area. What I'm hoping to do is more street reporting when it comes to these racism issues. We need to see the bigger picture and the long-term goals, like Jon was saying, communities bounded by social injustice. But to really tell the human story, the drama, you need to be able to capture the words and the emotions of the people living within it and living around it, and the fear that they will be next.
Yeah, thank you for telling us about that personal experience. I think that a lot of times these days we get so caught up in all of the news coverage that it's hard to, like you said, get that individual personal experience. So as a follow-up question, I wanted to ask Mr. Funabiki, how do you think that we can ensure that stories from Asian communities are not only told, but told with nuance?
That's great. Well, first, those of you who are going to become journalists, I hope you'll be paying attention to all of these tips and to follow some of Anne's reporting, because she's really excellent at doing this. But if you're not a reporter, I think that you can, one, support the journalists who are doing this. So read Anne and buy the Los Angeles Times. Support your local community news organizations, including your ethnic news organizations, the Chinese language media, Spanish language media, the Black press, the Vietnamese radio, because often they are doing the kind of work that we really want to see. And we want to, and they can do it in a way that because they have great trust with their communities, they know what the issues are. But the other thing I'd like to suggest is that we urge journalists, and I would urge my colleagues in journalism, to take the tragedy that we're experiencing right now, this crisis that we're experiencing, and take it as an opportunity to try some new things, to be bold. So for example, could we create multiracial collaborations of reporters to tackle this story so that they can work together and share their perspectives, share their networks? Could we mount special projects or series or investigations, documentaries or podcasts that help communities cope with these issues, not just report on these issues, but actually help the communities figure out how to better their communities deal with hate crimes. There's a great example of this, so I'm not making this up. There's a great project called Not in Our Town, so you can Google Not in Our Town. Is a series of documentaries in which they have focused on how do communities organize against hate crimes. And then they use these documentaries to teach organizational skills in other communities so that other communities can be prepared to deal with hate crimes. This is really an attempt to make journalism proactive, to make journalism a force for good, rather than just simply keep telling us what's happening, not in just being reacting to the events, but trying to push us forward as a community. So there are lots of ways that journalists could really use this as a jumping off point for something that could be very helpful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's very valuable information for all of us, especially those of us who are journalism majors going forward. I'll pass it back to Nathan for the next question.
Thank you, Connie. So, I wanted to touch on the topic of politicians recently have addressed the recent surge in violence. We saw at the beginning video, President Biden talking about the recent hate crimes of Asian Americans and how, we have to treat each other like pretty much as neighbors. So Dr. Wang, to you, do you feel that our leaders have done enough to address the recent wave of hate crimes?
I really appreciated what Biden recently said in terms of, stop what's happening, stop blaming, stop scapegoating, stop attacking Asian Americans. That's un-American, it's wrong, and it must stop. But there's a couple of problems there, and I'll start with the fact that anti-Asian sentiments are actually very American. It is the bedrock of US history, and I'm not saying Asian American history, because Asian American history is US history. And so it is the bedrock of our experiences, dating back to the 19th century, to the late 19th century, early 19th century, late 18th century. So, to say it's un-American, I think is problematic because it's very American. Now, if he's saying it shouldn't be American, that's a different story, because it means that he recognizes how important it is for us to be actively anti-racist, as opposed to denying it and treating anti-Asian hate crimes and in general anti-Asian sentiments as something that is really like a one-time exception, which it is not. It has never been, and it won't be. And so what is very unique, I think, about Asian American history and about Asian American violence, and that's different from other communities, I think, is that it has been consistently, invoked as a form of patriotism and loyalty to the US when this country has felt insecure or has been insecure, right, in terms of economy, military, political threats. And Asians are easy to scapegoat. And that comes back to us, so that when something is happening in China or when there is competition with China, it comes back to hurt Americans who are Chinese. It hurts Americans who appear Chinese. And so, can leaders do more? Absolutely. And I would say that language is very important, as we know from the previous presidential administration. Language is also important now. And I think it is very, very important for the current administration to recognize that the status quo is racism, rather than the status quo is not racism and this never happens. And let's just fix this one thing, because then we will actually never address the institutional, the systemic root of the problem, which is white supremacy. And it's what we're all talking about in terms of what we are all, us and our BIPOC communities, what we are all bound by in terms of our shared suffering and consequently our shared liberation. And for us particularly, that is oftentimes, I think, in funding, right, in terms of funding resources for Asian Americans and recognizing Asian American suffering. And because we are in such denial about Asian Americans being one of us, right, being American, being belonging here just as much as other Americans, we exclude Asian Americans all the time from funding opportunities, from resources. Again, because of the model minority stereotype. But you see then how the model minority stereotype and the yellow peril stereotype, they're outsiders, they're dangerous, they're invaders, that comes together where US society sees us for how they want to, when they want to, and not for what we really are. So that is incumbent on leaders to change to really take a stance. Are you anti-racist or are you racist? There is no in between.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to ask Ms. Yang, as the pro bono director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice in LA, what do you think what else can be done on a national and local level for the Asian community?
Thanks, Nathan, for that question. I think, within the organization, we're always looking for folks who are looking to support our work, whether that's folks who identify as Asian, Pacific Islander or Native Hawaiian, or folks who I think we now all say, we're looking for folks who are allies, right? Whether those are people who, identify as part of the white majority or others who are part of communities of color or other marginalized groups. And I think that there's a lot of ways that folks can get involved at the local level with our organization. We're certainly looking for folks to volunteer with us in various capacities. In connection with our anti-Asian discrimination project, we launched a monthly series of legal clinics just last month in February, where we're focusing both on helping folks who identify as API or who are limited English proficient with housing issues relating to COVID, but also using that clinic hopefully to identify repeat bad actors who might be discriminating against folks in our communities, potentially to bring litigation against those bad actors. And those are clinics that are worked on by our staff, but also we collaborate with volunteers as well, from the local API bar associations, for example, or as the clinics scale up, hoping to involve more volunteers who are non-attorneys also, perhaps to serve as interpreters or to otherwise help folks with issues as they come through. And I think as far as the Bystander Intervention training program that we are launching later this spring, that's something that we're really hoping can spread far and wide within the API community as well as otherwise. And in our current times, these are going to be virtual trainings where we can train hundreds or even thousands of people at the same session. Some of our affiliates within the Advancing Justice affiliation are already doing these trainings with a lot of interest. And so we'd love to, equip people to go out there in the community and really feel like they're able to support others or tangibly feel like they're making a difference. I think, various of my fellow panelists have touched on, folks in our communities feeling like they are afraid to go out and identify as Asian or to, be, acting too Asian, maybe going to Asian supermarkets or neighborhoods. And really, I think wanting to take back some of that feeling and really to empower folks to, feel like they can be themselves again. And I think just touching on some of what Sherry just shared, it's really nothing new, but I think what's new is the increased attention from those who aren't directly affected or perhaps haven't known someone who's directly affected. And so in that sense, I think it's a great moment to continue to build strong allies for our communities and to really hopefully deepen relationships with folks to continue carrying forward this work.
Thank you.
Can I add a little bit more? Sorry,
yeah,
if that's okay. I just building on what Christina said, because it just made me think about, in terms of leaders, that we as leaders are responsible for creating a safe space for people to share about these experiences. And I think that part of that is that there needs to be accountability and consequences for racism, for anti-Asian racism, for racism of all kinds, but particularly for anti-Asian racism, which we find so casually used and just accepted, right, through jokes, through something that's just reference, and nobody says there's anything wrong with it, nobody stops it, nobody finds it to be a problem. And so I think that if it's new to you, if for you as an audience member or others who you're sharing this information with, if it has been new for you that Asian Americans experience racism, then you really haven't been a safe person for Asian Americans. You haven't been someone that Asian Americans have been able to confide in terms of what their experiences have been as Asian Americans. And I think for folks who are starting to speak up in corporate settings and institutions, what's also happening is that they are having to bear the brunt of the consequences because they're getting stigmatized for reporting. And so they're being punished for reporting or for saying or for intervening or things unacceptable. And then the actual perpetrator, the offender, nothing happens to them. But for the person who reported, who is already the victim, people now look at them differently and people start treating them differently. And so I think it really is incumbent on us, if you're in any position of leadership, to create a space where there is accountability and consequences for racism. And there's also a safe space for people to feel like this is an okay space for me to share about my racial trauma.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that last part about racial trauma that people have experienced and being able to overcome that, I think is so important. And for people to understand that definitely in our society to move forward, I think is a good step. So I'm going to move to Connie for the next question.
Okay, and this will be the last question we have before we open it up to audience Q&A. So participants, feel free to start thinking of your questions or sending them in. And this last question is going to be for Ms. Yang and Dr. Wang. There have been growing calls for justice in the wake of the increasing number of hate crimes in the Asian community. And it's only gotten louder after this Atlanta tragedy this week. But how can we balance this desire for justice without further criminalization and police prosecution in Black and Brown communities, and building coalitions between races instead of divisions? Let's start with Ms. Yang.
Sure. Thank you, Connie. And I did speak to this a little bit earlier, so I won't repeat what I said previously about, our desire to really decrease more aggressive police prosecution. But I will say that I think that there are some thoughtful legislators in California that are thinking about ways to address this in a way that is not harmful to communities of color generally. And I'm thinking in particular of AB 886 by Assemblymember Rob Bonta, the Hate Violence Victim Support Act. And this is a bill that we are supporting as Advancing Justice LA. And it really has a multifaceted response to incidents of hate violence directed at APIs, and is really focused on community-centered solutions, which I talked a bit about earlier, just looking at ways to look at some of the systemic reasons that these sorts of incidents are occurring, which I think Jon touched on earlier also, and really, in trying to address these incidents and not perpetuating that cycle of more systemic state violence in the form of more aggressive and discriminatory law enforcement, which I think at the end of the day just harms communities of color more. And so just briefly, the bill is really looking at three specific ways to provide services to survivors of these incidents, and focusing on restorative justice programs, which I think many folks may already be familiar with, helping folks think about these incidents and centering on repairing the harm caused by them, rather than just purely punitive approach. And then secondly, increasing funding for culturally competent mental health services for folks who survive these incidents, which I think ties back to some of my earlier comments. And then just thirdly, and this is fairly specific, just ensuring that victims of these incidents, that they're not denied victim compensation from the California Victim Compensation Program just because they didn't file a police report. And this is, I think for many of folks who are participating tonight might be obvious, like, if you think about, someone in our community, they might just be reluctant to file a police report because there are barriers to filing, language, fear of retaliation, there might be some other issues there. And so we just want to, remove some of those barriers for folks in the community. And so I think that there's really a spectrum of ways to I think seek justice for folks who have suffered these incidents. And I think, various of my fellow panelists have already said, we just don't really want to be too myopic and focused on, law enforcement is the only way. And I think that's kind of, if there's any message that I can send tonight, I think that that's something that I really want to make sure folks take away with them.
Thank you so much, for speaking on more of a legislative perspective on that. Dr. Wang, if you have anything to add, or if you want to touch upon how these other communities can stand in solidarity with the Asian American community right now, the floor is yours.
Yes, I'll try to do both in a response that's going to be concise. Everything Christina has said, I agree with. I do want to put this out there that, when we think about law enforcement, we think about it as safety. And so in that way, we are also having to reprogram ourselves if we thought that way. But that's how you grow up thinking, right? And when you go to school, you are taught, if there's stranger danger, you call the police, right? And so even as a child, we are taught these things of you go to the police when you need help. And so I think this issue of policing is really, it's really a challenge. And I am in full support of us looking at more restorative justice forms, ways of really finding accountability and consequences and recovery and healing for victims. At the same time, I also don't want to penalize too much the folks who are saying we need more policing, because they're not actually saying we need more police officers coming in and surveilling us and making us more scared. They haven't thought that far, I don't think. That's been my experience when people say we need more police. We're in crisis and we're desperate and we need people with power. And because right now I feel so powerless, my community is so powerless, that I need folks in positions of authority and power to be able to advocate for me. That's what we historically have thought of the police to be. And so I think it is important to distinguish, are we asking for more policing, or are we asking for more help? Are we asking for more services? Are we asking for more safety? I mean, I think that's the key thing. And the question to be asking us is, what does safety look like for us? What, if we can reimagine this, what would safety look like from a preventative standpoint, as opposed to a crisis standpoint now of like, we need to find the perpetrator and punish them because, okay, that's the criminal justice does this. And sometimes not in a just way, right? Not even what victims want. And then do you feel better as a victim? Does this actually help the community heal? Not necessarily. And so I don't think this is just an issue of anti-Blackness. And I think that's what the issue has become, that when Asian Americans have said, we need more police, sometimes Asian Americans get shut down to say that's anti-Black. And then it's just end the conversation. And I think that's unfortunate because it's so much of a deeper issue. And anti-Blackness and our tendency to go to the police for help, or to think of going to the police as the people who will save us, those go hand in hand in the sense that those are things that we are programmed with, that we've been socialized into doing and being. That anti-Blackness is part of also the fabric of our society. It's in the air that we breathe. And thinking about the police as our form of safety, that is also, it's been in the water that we drink, and we are having to work really hard to go against how we were socialized and taught. And it's really, really hard work. And I think it's really important to say that, so that when folks may feel shut down by even saying, I'm asking for help, but now I'm shut down because what I'm being accused of is being anti-Black. I wish we could just provide more space for people to talk about their pain. Asian Americans are in a lot of pain, and it does not justify anti-Blackness. But the thing is, everybody perpetrates anti-Blackness, and we need to address that. And right, not or, and at the same time, it's really important to hear the pain that Asian American communities are feeling. So in the research I'm doing, one of the main things that I'm trying to really convey over and over in my talks, my presentations, has been recognizing that the model minority stereotype is anti-Blackness. It is, because the model minority stereotype emerged during the civil rights movement, really to say, let's use Asian Americans. Let's use Asians as a weapon. Let's objectify and exploit them and take the things that we see in them to compare them to suppress Black people. And that way, right, we can say, Black people, brown people, why can't you be like them? Look at how, hardworking they are and quiet. Look at their families, and they don't use social services and they don't engage in activism. Why can't you be like that? So first of all, that not only hurts the Black community to be compared in that way, and then divides us, right? Black versus Asian Americans, it also hurts Asian Americans. And I think this is the part that people don't know or think about as much, is that as Asian Americans, it hurts us because those were never aspects of us that we wanted to be used to be pervasive parts of who we are, right? Those were stereotypes those were aspects of us that were chosen and picked out because white America wanted to see that and then put it as a stereotype on us and call it a character trait when they're not. And it erases not only our diversity, right, in terms of just the wide range of who we are as Asian Americans, that we are not all doing well, right? And that those assumptions at the time were really focused on Chinese and Japanese Americans. And it does not account for example, the wide socioeconomic disparity within our communities. It doesn't account for our suffering. It doesn't account for our needs. It erases our activism, actually, which we are. As Asian Americans, we are actually politically involved. It erases also our excellence, because when we do things that are amazing and when we go above and beyond, people don't recognize that because, hey, you should be like that. weren't you just born with good math and science genes, right? That these were assigned to us rather than attributed to our actual hard work and labor. And so we've been seen in a colorblind way to hold down Black people. And then it also hurts us too. And so believing that is a form of anti-Blackness. The mono-minority myth, because it is anti-Blackness, it stands for anti-Blackness, it really makes sense that Asian Americans were already positioned to be anti-Black. And that's why for us to really work to combat anti-Blackness, to combat white supremacy, it is us having to fight against the mono-minority stereotype at the same time. And it's us, I think, asking for other communities to recognize. So when other communities say, well, what do you mean Asian Americans struggle? What do you mean? What do you mean, you need services, or that your communities are poor? That is a form of anti-Blackness. That is a form of racism. And I think when we understand it that way, then we also recognize how anti-Blackness hurts all of us, every single one of us, in different ways. And I think in that way, we really can build cross-racial, cross-cultural coalitions to recognize how white supremacy splits us and divides us and has us fighting for tiny bits of resources when there's so much more that we are all entitled to if we work together and we figure out who our common enemy is, which is the system, right? And to go after it in solidarity.
Yeah, I can't think of a better or a more poignant note to end on. Dr. Wang, Ms. Yang, thank you so much for both your insightful answers to that. I'll pass it off to Nathan now to introduce our audience Q&A section.
Thanks, Connie. So yes, we did get a lot of Q&A questions from the audience so far. So thank you for those who have submitted them. We can't get to all of them, but we will ask some that I think will be good to answer. So one question that I got, it's important for the USC community to send a strong message of condemnation to all anti-Asian settlement and to all the welcoming of new students. So my question, is there any advice that you panelists have for the school overall, just to be clear as possible that this will not be tolerated at USC? I'll open it up for anyone.
I think speaking as a student, talking to other students, we've been in classes where we feel like maybe the discussion around what it means to be Asian is being co-opted by white professors who really view, this is my personal experience. I was in a class my first year, and I talked to other people who taken the class, and we all had that same experience where the professor kind of viewed the East as very exotic, and it really contributed to the idea that Asian Americans are forever foreigners, despite having literally been here since, Filipino people have been in America since the 1500s. We've been here for a long time, and yet no matter what, we are perpetually viewed as forever foreigners. And there are classes and curriculums that contribute to that idea. And so when students do file complaints with the dean or in our student evals, we speak up about this, very little action has been taken. And I think this is something that this past summer, when APASA, the Asian Pacific American Student Assembly, and the Black Student Assembly came together, or not this past summer, sorry, last semester, there was an incident regarding a professor who said a Chinese word that sounded like the N-word and was removed. I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but the way USC handled it had some undercurrents of xenophobia, and it wasn't what the Black community wanted or the Asian community wanted. When BSA and APASA came together, they were really clear. They were like, hey, we have professors who have been saying the N-word in class. We have professors who are racist towards Asian people. We've been complaining about this, and yet the school doesn't take action on that. So I think the school can take action on what the students are demanding rather than do publicity stunts that make the school look good.
Thank you, Joyce. Yeah, I have one more.
I really think that there's a lot of talk and there's not enough listening, and the art of being a rare good listener is just not cultivated. Instead of always waiting for people to tell us, why don't we just ask them? And You know, you're not on campus right now, so have maybe a digital suggestion box and let people submit thoughts anonymously and by name. I'm just thinking of the reporting process. The way that we get the best stories oftentimes is to take a step back and let things evolve and just let people jump from one topic to another with a firm nudge here and there. And then they will tell you in their own words things that ordinary methods will not illuminate.
Yeah, thank you so much. This next question from the audience, I'd like to ask Mr. Funabiki. Do you think that the increased coverage of these attacks may be potentially harmful in that it, quote unquote, normalizes attacks on Asians and perhaps emboldens more people to commit these anti-Asian hate crimes?
I think that's a possibility whenever we're dealing with this kind of activity. You know, we face that danger when we've had attacks at Black churches, right? We face that danger in many, just the simple acts of arson, fires in buildings and things. We're always concerned that we might spur copycats. That's why it's really important not to in any way idolize the perpetrators or the suspects, to glorify them. Some people argue that we shouldn't even name the suspects in these kinds of crimes because it might stimulate copycats. It is a danger, but I also think it would be far worse if we did not report on these, we did not let the community know, and did not have ways to, arm people with knowledge.
Absolutely. And I'm just curious from a reporter standpoint, Ms. Do, if you could touch on that too. Do you think that having this coverage is dangerous or emboldens more people?
I think you can apply that question to a lot of major tragedies that occur, but news happens, and whether we cover it can't make it unhappen. So the thing to do is to try to do it responsibly. And that's why I'm such a big believer in on-the-ground reporting. You know, it's harder to go outside in a pandemic for sure, but working from home all the time is not going to take you to the heart of the matter. Really think that we can strategize our coverage to try to amplify the quieter voices. That's really, really crucial for me. And not just to go to the same so-called leaders. And they're so-called or called that way for a reason, and many of them deserve a lot of credit. But sometimes I see that media, when they're launching on a new topic, they do a LexisNexis study to see what's been covered in this area. And then they tap some of the people who have been previously quoted. I try to really avoid that because it kind of gives you an inherent bias. You can discover your own sources. That's part of the fun. It's like a scavenger hunt. And you will, at the end of the day, at the end of the story, find treasures.
Thank you. We'll move on to one of these next questions. So a question that I think is relevant, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic and students studying at home, everyone working from home remotely. There's a lot of talk about mental health, and we talk about the media and representing people we cover, but also how can we push for mental health services and professionals that will be understanding of the Asian American experience?
I'm gonna guess that's the question for me. Thinking about the mental health component. I do think part of, I'm not a journalist, although, if I weren't a psychologist, that would have been the career that I would have chosen for sure. Just gonna say I was editor-in-chief, co-editor-in-chief in high school. I really wanted to go to journalism school. responsible reporting for me, part of it is critical thinking, not just the reporter, but then also leaving it critical for the viewers or for the audience too. And I think that in some ways, in thinking about mental health, you know, the automatic thing I'm going to go to is funding and resources, because how can mental health be accessible if it's not even in the language of the person who needs it in? If there's no attentiveness to cultural sensitivity, it may be available actually, but it is not accessible. And so it doesn't exist. And I think, you know, reporting about these kinds of things, I wish sometimes that stories covering these issues would talk more, not just about, you know, this is what happened, period. But this is what happened, and, you know, what might be the range of possibilities, and leaving it there. Because I think the audience should engage in critical thinking of like, I wonder why, as opposed to there must be just one answer. You know, for why something has happened. Thinking about, for example, perpetrators, that I think, you know, usually mental health issues are brought up, right? And it's just brought up, and then there's no further elaboration on what happens next. And I think that's in some ways thinking about the accountability piece too. That for me, when I have watched the media and seen coverage of leaders, political leaders who have been able to say really racist, horrible things, what we are seeing is not only just the content of what they're saying, right? And that's being perpetuated and retweeted millions of times. So we're also seeing how racism is played out directly, but also the role modeling of, and then there's no consequences. Like nothing happens to them afterwards. And I wish there was a reporting on that, as opposed to just look at the sensational, crazy thing that this person said, and that's it. And there's no accountability. Can we cover them to say, look at this, and I don't actually, let me take back, I shouldn't say crazy, because I really don't want to stigmatize mental health in that way, right? But look at this ridiculous and inappropriate thing that was said, and not just end it there, right? But then but hey, what are the consequences? Usually there should be these kinds of consequences. Are we going to see them? And so it leaves, I think, the audience, and it should leave us questioning and thinking about what happens next, rather than this happened, oh my gosh, story's over.
Exactly. And you know, I want to go to Ms. Yang, and as general counsel, I'm sure you've seen a lot of that as well in your own experience. How have you seen mental health play in with Asian Americans and their stance in, you know, going through school, going through their careers?
Sure, Nathan. And I think Sherry touched on many of the things that I'm about to briefly mention, but I think, you know, just, and I assume many of our audience members may identify as API or, you know, grew up with parents who came here from another country. And I think many of us can likely relate to, you know, not really growing up where, you know, talking about how you felt or helping process experiences after the fact was, you know, encouraged. I think, speaking personally, you know, that definitely was not like a huge part of my childhood, you know, and I think, you know, that I think does contribute to some hesitancy in, you know, engaging in what now, as a grown adult, I think is a really necessary part of self-care. I think especially as we are going through just a really difficult last 12 months as an American society and as a world, you know, the pandemic, George Floyd's murder, and all the societal uprising after that, and now this anti-Asian hate that I think we all are experiencing as something hitting very close to home. And it just seems like one thing after another. And as you mentioned, Nathan, with everyone working from home, or not everyone, many people working from home, studying from home, you know, we just don't have those normal outlets for processing our lived experiences together either. I mean, just this week, because of what happened in Atlanta at Advancing Justice LA, we've been, you know, I think many of our staff are very focused on, you know, helping the community and getting the word out to folks about what resources we have available, doing the work and not really having any time to pause and think about how it's affecting us personally. You know, and so we're really trying to encourage our staff to, you know, take a day to decompress, you know, talk to your supervisor. We're having a sort of group processing session tomorrow that's totally optional for people to join virtually, and just trying to replicate some of those normal in-person interactions that we might have, which now are a lot harder. You're not going to run into someone in the hallway and give them a hug right now. And so I think we're just doing our best to try to support staff, and also frankly, it's clients coming through for services that aren't really related directly to what we see happening right now in the community. But, people are still experiencing, reading things in the newspaper, reading things online, or maybe even hearing about something happening to someone that they care about, and, trying to be conscious of that too, when we are working with the folks that we're helping in other ways.
Thank you.
And one more thing, if that's okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Christina just says such great things, and I'm always like, yes, she just, reminded me of something. I recently consulted with one of the national news outlets with the question of how do we do a better job reporting on the anti-Asian hate crimes, and why is it that we are not getting as much attention on it, right? Even what can we be doing differently? And one of the things that this reporter asked me, or this journalist asked me, was, do you think it's because we don't show the victims' faces? Is that why we're not getting as much coverage? Because is it because maybe Asian culture, and that's a stereotype too, right? But is it because there's more shame in Asian cultures that they don't want to be on camera afterwards, they don't want to talk about it, and with that being the case, then does it make it less less, I guess, exciting, right? Then because it's not on camera, and could that be the reason why people don't pay as much attention to anti-Asian racism in this country? And I had to kind of say, well, let's talk about it together, because there's a lot of assumptions there that are problematic. One of them being that a good news story hopefully isn't one that is sensationalizing violence, and that was really, I think, what he was speaking of. That if you show the victims' faces, if they're crying or if their family members are sobbing, that's going to make a better news story. And that's actually, I said, that's actually pretty exploitative. and they agreed with me. Actually, they agreed with me that that's not what they wanted. But they're just wondering, right? Because the statement I made that anti-Asian hate crimes just don't get attention, and it took a very long time for it to get mainstream attention. And so in that sense too, one of the things I talked about was that even with the Black community, there's been appropriate criticism of how comfortable U.S. society is with seeing Black and brown bodies being brutalized on TV, to the point that it's just normal now. And now we're saying, should we do that with Asian Americans to get the same attention, or to get equal attention? That's very problematic in how we're thinking about, I think, audience and attention. And so I just thinking about, this venue in terms of journalists and media folk, I think it's really important to think about then what makes a good story, and how do you tell a story, and how do you do it in ways that are going to be responsible to the mental health and well-being of the watchers, because that is racial trauma. You don't have to be the victim of a physical hate crime directly in it to be racially traumatized right now. Like, the definition of racial trauma is basically exposure to racism. And so if you know what's happening in this country, you are traumatized right now. You're either scared for yourself, and scared for your loved ones, and living in anxiety and walking on eggshells, and fearful probably of going outside the door, because you don't know actually who the perpetrator is. You don't know what the enemy looks like, and you don't know how to prepare yourself other than hope you blend in and that nobody sees how Asian you are. Right? I mean, that's really what it is. And so I hope for media to really be more cognizant of what it means to be showing such graphic scenes of violence. I mean, I think it's good and important on the one hand, but we're also seeing an issue now of the constant posting and reposting of traumatic images, and what that does for our psyche and our soul as a country and as communities, to see folks who constantly to constantly have that racial traumatization be on repeat.
Yeah, I want to add something to what Dr. Wang said. The way to get more stories told about anti-Asian racism is for more people to come forward with those stories. a lot of other communities of color are less hesitant to voice their pain overall. And, as a generality, people are staying far too silent. There's way too many anonymous sourcing, no ready on the record kind of accounts. I think that as journalists, we're really sometimes frustrated or hugely challenged because people don't want to give their names. It's not just like the lack of showing the images, like Dr. Wang said. It's a quiet culture in general. There's a lot of shame burden for the people who are undergoing trauma, and they have to overcome those cultural stigmas. So please talk to us. We're not going to exploit your stories. I think that many of us would treat them, with the care and the authenticity that they deserve.
Absolutely. And on that note, I'd love to move on to the next question. This one is for Mr. Funabiki. The events in Georgia prompt us to ask questions about the intersecting roles of AAPI identity and gender. If you could speak on that a little bit, that would be great.
Well, I'm sure that the others could speak about this a lot, but from a media point of view, I think that one of the things we have problems with as journalists is we oversimplify and we start to categorize stories as a race story, as a gender story, right? As an employment story, et cetera. And we're not seeing how these things are connected. And for Asian Pacific Americans, this is especially important because of the way that media have tended to stereotype. We've been talking about this all night. Have stereotyped Asian American. To be an Asian American in the United States is to have a kind of a two-edged sword when it comes to media. On the one hand, as we've said, we're seen as the model minority, we're perfect, we're benign. On the other hand, we're the perpetual foreigner, we're the invaders, right? And when you add the dimension of gender and the exotification of women, especially Asian women, and the way that we tie Asian women to any number of sex-related issues, prostitution, right? The massage parlors here is just a perfect example of this. It becomes a much more complicated story, and it takes much more sensitivity and better reporting to help us understand the different dimensions of this story.
Yeah, on that note, if any of the other panelists would like to jump in about kind of what Mr. Funabiki talked about with media portrayals of Asian women that are exotic or fetishized, go ahead.
Yeah, I just think it's important to remember that this isn't just a story about, and people are asking, like, is this even about race? It is about race, and it is about gender, and it's about fetishization, misogyny. It's about economic exploitation. It's about poverty. It's about colonialism, and it's about erasure. It can be about all of those things at once. And, we need to address that these identities are intersectional, and that, especially regarding Asian women, like the US has a history of like sexualizing, trafficking Asian women during wars, and that trauma from our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers can be seen like now. And also the attitudes that Americans have towards Asian women really stem from those, like the larger systemic issues that America has.
Thank you, Joyce. So I think we have time for one more question from the Q&A. There was a question about Asian news coverage and how there was people have seen a lack of Asian news coverage, before these recent attacks in Atlanta. So I'll start with Ms. Do. On your opinion on, what have you seen even during your career about the news coverage that has been happening with Asian Americans, people's views on how Asian Americans are in different crimes they commit? I'll have you take it over.
Thank you, Nathan. I think that coverage sometimes is linked to population. In Los Angeles County, Latinos have the largest population. So at the LA Times, we have, a core group of reporters devoted to Latino issues, and we're always looking to tell more, not less. And we have quite a number of Asian American reporters at the paper, but instead of being assigned a specialty, diverse beats, it turned out that they're assigned to cover issues like the environment or, earthquakes or coronavirus, vaccinations, things like that. And so then you quantify the coverage and it seems a little slanted. What newsrooms have done in recent years is to participate in these diversity audits, which reveal like the numbers of different ethnicities that are on staff. And then we see where we're short and where we try to balance things out. I think part of it is when you have this perception that there's less coverage, it's because sometimes our audience engagement teams are looking at the metrics and seeing what drives the online traffic, whether it's specific themes, topics, cultural coverage, that sort of thing. We need to do better about that. And right now there's only basically one person covering Asian American issues. That's me. And then we also have a columnist that covers Asian American issues. And compared to the other cultural groups, it's a little bit less. And then we're also challenged by the fact that people still don't want to pay for content. So I appreciated what Jon said earlier is, coverage costs money. And, covering the Olympics, covering Lakers basketball, all those things. But it's kind of odd sometimes to get emails from your friends and say, I can't read your story because it's behind a paywall. So there lies our sort of ongoing challenge.
Awesome, thank you. And I guess follow up with that to Mr. Funabiki, as a journalism educator with many years in the field, how have you seen in your personal experience what Ms. Do talked about?
Things have gotten better in terms of coverage of Asian Americans, but it often has to do with the local population. So Anne is working in Los Angeles. I'm up here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We both have large Asian American populations. The news media know that they have to cater to those audiences as much as possible. But if you go into other parts of the country where there are very few Asian Americans, you're going to see very little coverage about Asian Pacific Americans. And that contributes to this media invisibility problem. It contributes to the misunderstandings that people have because, even if you're living in Kansas, Asian Americans will affect your lives and you will affect Asian American lives. So all the media across the country in all forms of media, whether it's, television, newspapers, radio, social media, et cetera, we've all got to be doing a better job. We need many more Asian American journalists working. Gratefully, the numbers have gone up considerably since when I started in this business. And we have Asian Americans in prominent positions in large news networks. And you can see the results of that. You're seeing coverage of the hate crimes led by Asian American reporting teams at ABC, NBC, PBS, the Los Angeles Times, right? So that makes a big difference. So if there's ever a time to pitch Asian Americans to think about journalism in the media, this is the time. You can make a difference. Media need you. It's still a very, it's not a perfect world. And we need people who can help reinvent journalism. In my teaching, I always ask my students, don't go out and do the journalism of the past, do the journalism of the future.
And it's not a perfect world, but it's a fantastic job. I have stayed in this profession my entire life, and there are no regrets. And every day is just like really exciting day because you don't have a set job description. You do new things all the time, and you work on your toes and you innovate.
Can I just say how exciting and necessary Asian Americans are in this field? Above and beyond just what I have so many thoughts that I'm trying to find my words. So maybe I'll just read some of it because, when the shootings in Georgia happened, we didn't get a list of the victims' names, right? We learned first of the perpetrator's name, and it took a while actually to actually get the victims' names. And I actually didn't even get it from any of the national or local news outlets. I got it from an Asian American Instagram account, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, how did you get this? I said, thank you for I'm reading my phone. Thank you for this info that we still aren't seeing in mainstream media. And they said, and I'm not Korean, so maybe I'm mispronouncing it. I said, Ajuma ain't talking to no white reporters. They're the enemy as far as some are concerned. And I said, true that. And they said, this is why you need a diverse news staff with genuine connections to the community. So, and then we had a longer conversation that actually, South Korea had more information on the names of the victims before it was released in the US. And I don't know how true or how much, this is really just a conversation we had through Instagram, texting. But that really speaks to the relationship that journalists have to have with the community to even get names and information, and how I think appropriately distrusting our community members can and should be, not just to journalists, because I think we should think about journalists and media. And I think about it for myself too, as a mental health provider. Even if I have good intentions, my clients don't automatically trust me. I have to work and earn that trust. And so I think same for media folks. And even if you earn their trust, when you tell their story, it is to a larger society that is not safe, that will not offer the protections when Asian Americans share their stories of victimization. And so I do think it's so important to have more of us, language speaking, right? Linguistically diverse, as well as I think culturally, that we are culturally similar and understanding the customs and aware of what does shame look like and how do we overcome shame when talking about certain issues. But knowing, for example, the complexities of gendered racism with what happened in Atlanta, of misogyny.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Okay,
have to get to the last final.
Yes.
You're good. So I just want to wrap up the night asking each and every one of you in one sentence answer, where do we go from here? So I'll start with Joyce.
Yeah, so I think right now there is a sense of powerlessness in the community, but I think this is the worst time to have that feeling of powerlessness. And we need to remind ourselves that we do have some agency, we do have some power. Abstractly, I think we need to radically reimagine the systems we live in to move towards one of liberation, to move towards one of love and kindness, and more concretely, get involved with your local grassroots organizations, get involved with, for example, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, get involved with SCAPE. We're working with multiple community organizations that combat the other forms of violence that Asian Americans face, like economic violence, the violence of deportations, the violence of gentrification, et cetera. So just get involved.
Thank you. Ms. Yang?
Yeah, Nate, it's hard to limit to one sentence, but I do think just, continuing dialogue, raising awareness of where we sit as Asian Americans facing these really unfortunate hate incidents these last many months, and just, again, being cognizant of, what sorts of reforms or actions we're calling for from our leaders and how they might impact our fellow communities of color.
Thank you. Ms. Do?
I think the way forward is to reinvest in community sourcing and letting the people tell the stories through you in their own words, in powerful but meaningful ways.
Thank you. Mr. Funabiki?
Well, unfortunately, at some point, this crisis, the headlines about this crisis will fade because journalists kind of respond to the next disaster, the next crisis. And then they start to forget, and then the next one happens. And what I hope is that journalists will put more time into what they do between the crises, right? That's where it's going to really make a difference. They can start to build these relationships with the community. They can hire more Asian American journalists. They can do more stories about Asian American lives and communities and the real lived experiences, and not simply jump from one crisis to another. So I would argue for more attention to that time that occurs between the crises.
I know we're at 7:30, but Dr. Wang, if you have really quick thoughts.
Really quick, relationship building. I think I've said it before. I think building relationships with each other and within the Asian community. I mean, people called it China virus, or, Kung flu. And there were other Asians, because we're diverse, who were like, yeah, I agree with that, because our countries have gone to war with China. And so I think it's a time for Asian Americans to come together, galvanized in our identity, to stand with each other, support one another, and then recognize also how our suffering is tied to the suffering of other racial ethnic minorities as well. And then to insert ourselves actively in that as well. I mean, for example, I don't know if folks know, but with Black Lives Matter, Asian Americans are one of the largest supporters of Black Lives Matter. And so when there's coverage on Black Lives Matter, interview Asian Americans and showcase our solidarity, because we're there. We are in the front. We're marching. We're protesting. But people don't know that, and this needs to be out front to show our visibility, because we're there.
Thank you so much. That is the end of our Q&A portion, but thank you to all of our incredible panelists. I'm going to pass it to Michael and Eddie to close out the show.
Thank you again to all the panelists, Ms. Anh Do, Mr. Jon Funabiki, Joyce Jang, Ms. Christina Yang, and Dr. Sherry Wang for sharing your time and expertise with all of us tonight. Now, let's give them a virtual round of applause. And we would like to thank all of you, all the attending members, for your support, and we hope that you will continue to stand in solidarity with the Asian American community. For students and faculty, we hope that you will continue to work with the host organizations, the Asian American Journalists Association, USC chapter, and the Annenberg Cross-Cultural Student Association.
And we would also like to thank our advisors, Dana Chin and Mickey Turner, the Tech Ops and events crew for running this event seamlessly, as well as the school directors, Hector Amaya and Gordon Stables, and Dean Willow Bay for their continued support. And most importantly, we would like to thank you, the audience, for a wonderful turnout and for coming and joining us in this important discussion. This will conclude our panel discussion, and enjoy the rest of your evening.